You're listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place. Hello, I'm your co-host Charlie Mushaw, the superior bringer-inner of listeners, according to Michael.
I am your co-host, award-winning novelist Michael G. Williams, who is not good at doing intros because I never know exactly what to say. And if you ever have the opportunity to meet me in person, you're going to realize that very quickly.
I just make it all up.
Doing better than I am.
So we have a few housekeeping things to bring up for our dear listeners. We appreciate every single one of you, and we hope to meet you at Con Carolinas, Friday, June 4th in Charlotte, North Carolina. We'll be giving a talk at 10:30 p.m. on Friday in the Harris Room titled Goblin Talk, Folklore, Fiction, or David Bowie.
I'm so looking forward to this. I think it's going to be great.
I am so amped that what started as me like half joking about wanting to explore goblin folklore out of the Uwaris has turned into not only an episode, but a live episode.
It's going to be really great. And we might, depending on if we can figure it out and if it's not a big pain, be live streaming it on Facebook or something that night when it happens. You never know.
Yeah.
The possibilities are endless. This will also be the first episode that we have ever recorded in person together.
That's right, because when we started, it was already lockdown.
Yeah.
Wow. That's pretty wild.
Isn't it? It occurred to me the other day and I was just like, oh my God, we're going to record an episode in the same place.
Which we've done before for another show.
Yeah, a long time ago.
A long time ago. But here we are. And if you do come in person to Con Carolinas, Michael's being very humble and not plugging himself right now. He will have a author's table outside of the Keynes and Burnham room, and he will have a full slate of appearances on multiple panels, and you should check him out. I will not. It's going to be like Where's Waldo with Charlie. I'll be walking around. Michael will be talking.
I love convention panels, and so I volunteered for a lot of them. If you are at Con Carolinas and you go to the Author's Alley downstairs, I'll be in the corner next to internationally best-selling author A.J. Hartley, who will have a lot of books too. I'll have a little sign on my table with what my panels are that day. And
one more thing, if Charlotte's too far or June's not your thing and we're not able to get that live stream working, you can also catch us in July at Congregate. It's another fandom convention in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Yeah, I've been a guest to Congregate several years in a row. Really, really enjoy it. Great community. But this is true for both of them. Like, they're both really just great fan communities and wonderful people to get to be around. And it is a real treasure to be able to go back and see these folks again now.
So we've got stuff cooking for August. And then, of course, the fall is going to be pretty wild. But those are the two big ones. June 4th, Charlotte. Mid-July in Winston-Salem. Looking forward to doing some live stuff. But that is not what we're doing today. Today, we are doing a very regular episode.
As opposed to a very special episode.
Yes. Yeah. See, I can say different things. I'm like Woody from Toy Story, how he's got like the 5 sayings, pull the string. It's like one of them is, today on a very special episode.
So today, we're going to talk about an old Cherokee legend, supposedly, called the Moon-Eyed People.
Not to be confused with the Moon Pie People.
Very different. Very, very different people. The Moon Pie People, you can like go find readily and patronize them. But you cannot find the Moon-Eyed People and you cannot patronize them. First of all, I'm going to preface this by saying that I am not Cherokee and I'm not an expert on Cherokee culture or history. And so by talking about this, I just want to be really careful that I don't misrepresent myself as being someone of that origin and that I don't give people the impression falsely that I am the expert about Cherokee history and culture.
And to be frank and like transparent, we held off on talking about this for a year and actively solicited for someone to help us as an expert in that field. And we're unable to locate anyone.
But if you listening to this are an expert in that field and you've got opinions or feedback or something you wish had been contributed to the conversation, please let us know by emailing us at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com and getting in touch with us. I didn't grow up in that culture. That was not a part of my upbringing. That wasn't a part of my identity. And it would be really, 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 really unwanted for anyone to interpret me talking about this as me claiming that as my own heritage. That is not the case.
No, this just happens to be one of those big stories out of North Carolina that we need to cover because it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's famous. It's big. It's weird. We couldn't find anybody to help us out with it. So we're doing it.
And if we get it wrong, then we will be happy to correct ourselves later.
We're actually going to do an update episode at some point where we go back and we do updates on several of the things that we've covered over the course of the last year. All right. Sorry.
No, that's great. No, this is good because we need to get all that out of the way for me to feel comfortable talking about this. So the legend as we sometimes hear it now.
It's always a great way to start.
This description is going to include some caveats and sometimes is, because the legend gets represented and retold and told again in different ways in different places, and it takes different forms depending on the sources. But I started to say in short, but really in medium, the way we sometimes hear it now. First, that the Cherokee told early European arrivals that when the Cherokee moved into the Appalachians in western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and northern Georgia, they found the region already inhabited by, quote, a race of moon-eyed people. In some of these descriptions, the moon-eyed people are very small people, no higher than like 3 feet tall, who have long hair and great big eyes. In some of those descriptions, the moon-eyed people's eyes are solid white, and that's where the term moon-eyed people comes from. And in some of those descriptions, the moon-eyed people are the same height as the Cherokee, but have pale skin, beards, and blue eyes, and had built many stone fortifications throughout Tennessee and northern Georgia, including, in some versions of the legend, those specifically at Fort Mountain, Georgia, which is in far northern Georgia. It's near where Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina meet. And again, sometimes in these legends, the reason the Cherokee called them the moon-eyed people is because they could not see in the daytime. They could only see at night. Or, again, because they had large, round, milky white eyes that looked like the moon. Either way, regardless of which of those details are included in a given telling, according to the legend, the Cherokee, or sometimes the Creek Indians, went to war with the moon-eyed people, drove them out of the region, or allowed them to retreat. And then, in some of them, they literally drove them underground and then took their land.
See, one, they can't see during the day. That'd be a pretty easy enemy to defeat. Just attack them during the day.
Yeah.
Two, the version that I had always heard was that they were small with the big eyes, kind of like mystical people that lived underground, like gnomes or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's the version I have always heard.
So, and I'll talk a little more about this later, but the moon-eyed people legend, specific to the idea of people who couldn't see during the day, could see at night unless there was a full moon, because even the full moon was too bright for them to see by. That is often conflated with the Cherokee legend of the little people, which is very similar to the European Fae legend.
Mm-hmm.
So some versions of this legend also, they go further than that. And they suggest specifically that the moon-eyed people were descendants of a figure named Prince Madoc, a Welsh prince who sailed west across the ocean in the 12th century CE when he became disgusted by a bloody civil war between his brothers as they vied for the throne of Gwynedd in modern-day Wales.
The Welsh.
The Welsh.
Beautiful people.
Part of it.
We were okay. Full disclosure. We were talking about. I was like, I don't know anybody that's Welsh, and then I Googled famous Welsh people. I was like, oh, so I do. And who was it? Who was it that was Welsh?
Was it Catherine Zeta-Jones?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I was like, oh, well, I'll be.
In this version of the Prince Madoc take on the legend of the moon-eyed people, the story goes that Prince Madoc got together a ship full of followers when he said, this civil war in Wales sucks, and I'm going to get out of here, and let's sail west and see what we find. And then they land in Mobile Bay, Alabama in 1170, or what is now Mobile Bay, Alabama, explores the rivers of the Southeast, encounters the Native Americans, builds a bunch of stone forts in the region, including the rock wall fortifications at Fort Mountain, Georgia. Then he tells the people that came with him, okay, y'all stay here and establish colonies. And I'm going to go back to Wales and see who else wants to come live here with us, because it doesn't look like there's any hint of that Welsh Civil War bothering us if we just stay here. Then he sails back to Wales, recruits enough people to fill 10 more ships, then sails back to North America with them, they settle in the southeast, and they're never heard from again.
Hmm.
And there are a ton of variations on that legend. And if things weren't confusing enough, like I just said to you, it's often conflated with the Cherokee concept of the little people, who are this like really complex and distinct legend that kind of deserves its own discussion at some other later date.
So what was the, I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
What was the date that this was all supposed to have occurred? Like roughly?
1170.
1170. So for between 1170 and then when European settlers hit the North Carolina mountains, we are to believe, and I know we're going to explore all this. I'm just like, I'm looking at a map and I'm trying to like work out the geography and the time and everything. That like over a couple hundred years, this group thrived enough to expand from the Gulf of Mexico up to the mountains. I'm looking at a map and trying to like figure it out. Oh,
you are 100% correct. The first acknowledged historical incident of European explorers encountering the Cherokee is when De Soto encountered the Cherokee in 1540. And when he showed up in the mountains of western North Carolina, the Cherokee were already there. They were already established. There were already towns like Juara, which we talked about in the Brown Mountain Lights. And these Moon-eyed people are not mentioned at all in any of that.
Okay. That's what I was getting at in my head of like trying to figure out like, okay, well, if they got here, like, and running with that going theory, that's who they were. So if they got here, then what happened in the time before?
Right. In that 370-year window, if Prince Madoc were real and his followers were real, then...
Sounds like an action figure. Sounds like an 80s cartoon villain. Prince Madoc. Maybe he's a good guy. I don't know.
It really does. According to this legend, Madoc was the son of a guy named Owain of Gwynedd, who is a well-known historical...
This is all like C-tier Thunderhawks villains.
Owain was this like real historical figure, this well-known, well-documented historical king of Wales, who did have 13 legitimate heirs when he died, and a bevy of dozens more illegitimate heirs who were considered actual contenders for his throne under Welsh tradition at the time. So when he died, like 50 people went to war with each other over his throne. That is historically true.
I want to now make a false 80s cartoon called Thunderhawks, because it's a combination of Thundercats and Silverhawks. And the main bad guy is Prince Madoc.
Prince Madoc.
Prince Madoc. He can be a good guy. I don't know. The jury's still out on that. But we're running with this. This is going to be like that fake arcade game. Had an urban legend around it.
Okay.
That's what we're doing right now. We're establishing that. That's canon. That's canon.
Okay. At one point, there was an 80s cartoon called Thunderhawks, and it was about Prince Madoc escapees. It's kind of like Prison Break meets Thundercats. The immediate question that springs to mind for me when I hear that legend is, well, okay, who was Prince Madoc?
Right.
Right. Like, so I just started looking into, okay, what's the real history of this Prince Madoc character? And in short, there isn't a real history because Madoc did not exist.
Except in my fictional timeline of the 1980s.
Exactly. Stories of Madoc first start appearing in English and Welsh poems in the mid-15th century, so 300 years after he's supposedly gone to North America. And the first time that anybody refers to him, they say, quote, he desired not land or worldly wealth, but the sea. There are claims in some references to him that there are mentions of Madoc in earlier works and that he went on this big epic sea voyage, but they've all either definitively been debunked or at best there is no supporting evidence for that. English and Welsh writers and storytellers started really hyping up Madoc, though, and this story that he went west and founded settlements in North America during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. It's a rebranding of the Irish legend of St. Brendan the Seafarer.
Because people didn't like the Irish, so they took their story.
That is one prong in the multi-pronged reason why this happened.
Wow.
If you're not familiar with the story of St. Brendan the Seafarer, I will not retell the entire epic saga. But suffice to say, he's this Christian monk in Ireland. There's this whole epic saga that involves him trying to sail west to the legendary island of Paradise. And he has to go through various trials on his way there. And those trials contain a bunch of symbolism and a bunch of numerology central to early Christian beliefs. And in fact, there was a whole genre of Irish and British Isles, quote, seafaring monk stories that sort of mirrored stories from earlier in Christianity about monks such as St. Anthony Abbot, who would like hike into the desert and go live in a cave and become wise and study their own faith. There's this whole genre of Irish and British Isle monks getting on a boat, going west to someplace, living on an island, becoming very wise, etc. And the Madoc myth probably first existed as an English appropriation of that Irish story model, using a conveniently available minor figure, kind of like when a minor comic book character gets brought into a movie franchise and turned into a really big deal, like Groot. Who's like a really minor character in the comics, but now that he's been in a movie is a huge deal. It's worth noting that if Madoc had been real and was never seen or heard from again, then how does anybody know where he landed?
Right. Yeah, there's no part of that story where they send people back after the big group.
Right. Yeah, after the big group, nobody ever comes back. He is just never seen or heard from again.
He sends his Thunderhawk.
Exactly. He sends his Thunderhawk across the sea. So how and why did that get stolen and used for this purpose? And the reason is it was explicitly to bolster English claims on North America in opposition to Spanish claims.
Oh, that's convenient.
Isn't it?
Oh no, we had a Welshman here.
So
well, where is he now? We don't know.
We never have heard from him again, but he's here. We're positive.
He's amongst the moon pie people.
By that point, the seat held by Madoc's supposed father, the throne of Gwynedd, which was this post-Roman successor state in modern-day Wales, had been absorbed into the British throne.
You will be taking that now.
Exactly.
That's ours. Thank you.
So John Dee, and for folks listening who are really familiar with English arcane mystical figures, yes, that John Dee, the English astronomer and alchemist who claimed to have learned ceremonial magic by channeled teachings from angels, he wrote up a legal justification for Elizabeth's claim to North America. And in it, he said that because
I said so.
That's pretty much it. Like, that's not a bad approximation. If you take out the stuff that's not true in it, then it boils down to that. Because in it, he said that because Elizabeth then held the throne of Gwynedd, effectively, and because an heir to the throne of Gwynedd had gone to North America and conquered part of it, quote unquote, then she had inherited those colonies the Madoc must have established, and thus it was all hers from hundreds of years ago. The Spaniards can go back home.
My girl Lizzie has this. Seat's taken.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's worth pointing out that Dee also claimed that because Brutus of Troy, as in like the Trojan War Troy, who at the time was really popular in English myth as the founder of Britain, they had this whole story that he was a soldier in the Trojan War. He was like one of the big deals in the Trojan War. And then afterwards he sailed west to get the heck away from Troy and wound up in Britain and became the first king of Britain.
Okay.
And he also claimed in the same document that King Arthur, as in like, yes, that King Arthur, traveled to North America and conquered parts of it. So Elizabeth definitely has a claim, and it definitely was not made up on the spot by spinning a big wheel labeled figures from not history.
Superman said I could have this, so I'm allowed to have it.
That is exactly the deal with this. John Dee knew what Elizabeth wanted to hear, and he wrote it for her.
You're in the Spanish, though. You're like, these aren't real people. No, they are. And they said we could have it. No, you made all of this up. No, it's ours now.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, there's people there that are like, hey, howdy, neighbor. What are y'all fighting over? Oh, my house. Oh. Huh. This is awkward.
It's funny you say that because at the time that this was happening, the Spaniards were exploring Western North Carolina and then getting killed by the Native Americans who got sick of their junk and ran them off.
I read an interesting thing. This might have to get cut because I don't know the source off the top of my head. But I read an interesting thing actually in South America and in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
So in Central South America and the Caribbean, there's accounts of like Sir Walter Raleigh's early expeditions, and that the indigenous peoples that they would run into, they'd be like, oh, thank God you're British. Those Spanish people are real lusty. Like, the Spanish conquistadors were so much worse than the British explorers. Like, they didn't like the British explorers. Oh, crap. There's a boat coming. Who is it? They're little and round, appear drunk. Oh, it's just the British. Okay.
Long and short of it is There is zero evidence that Madoc existed. He is not meaningfully referenced in anything prior to the 15th century, and none of what mentions him credits him with reaching North America prior to 1492. So it kind of makes it tough to buy any claims that he was real or that he made some pre-Columbian journey to North America.
Mm-hmm.
But the legend had legs, and it kept going. In 1686, a former British naval chaplain named Morgan Jones wrote to a friend that in 1669, so nearly 20 years earlier, he had been traveling through North Carolina when he was captured by a Native American tribe called the Doeg. That the Doegs spoke Welsh, and that they spared his life when he cried out in Welsh, "Have I escaped so many dangers, and must I now be knocked on the head like a dog?" when they were going to kill him. That they understood him when he cried out in Welsh, and that saved his life. And then he spent the next several months preaching the gospel to them in Welsh, and they subsequently converted to Christianity and spared his life and let him go. Unfortunately, Jones conveniently did not write this down until nearly 20 years after it happened, and after other writers had started publishing weird made-up accounts of similar stories. And it only achieved any publicity because the friend he wrote it to was the lieutenant governor of the new colony of Pennsylvania.
I'm getting big Becky Cotton vibes. That minister that was just like, and now in the second edition, I added this detail. And in the third edition, that detail.
Yep. And even more conveniently, that lieutenant governor's letter that he received with this story wasn't even published until sometime in the 18th century. So the supposed event becomes historically very distant from the account of it.
Right.
It's also important to note that the Doeg were a real tribe, and they spoke a dialect of Algonquin, not Welsh. They didn't speak Welsh at all, but they were involved in an ongoing land dispute with European colonizers. So they, along with other native peoples, loomed pretty large in the colonial imagination at the time. And if Jones actually wrote that letter in the first place, he may have done so thinking that portraying the Doeg as converted cousins of the Welsh would spare them from violence.
That's nice.
Yeah.
I say, these are nice people. Let's try not to kill them. There's the British colonizers weren't the best, but they also weren't the worst.
Yeah, pretty much.
That plays into something that we've talked about offline, though. Like when you look at this sort of thing, it's what needs to be kept in mind today, where you can't say all blank are blank, whatever narrative. Not all Spanish explorers were killing people. Not all British explorers were also trying to kill people.
Yeah.
I guess not all explorers are killing people is the point I'm trying to make. And that's nice. That's a twist I didn't see coming.
Yeah, there's this like weird compassionate edge to this theory of where that account came from.
I'm still going to take your house, but I don't want you to be killed.
Exactly. There's also a theory that maybe he wrote it as a lie to exaggerate his own career.
No, people
I know,
never do
that's
that.
Unthinkable. Or he may never have written it all, or he may have written it to his friend as a joke, just to see if he could pull his friend's leg.
Sure.
Why not?
I much prefer that he was doing it to save them from violence. I either want it to be a joke or to save the people from violence. So those are my votes.
Yeah, those are the ones I like the best. But so that's part of the deal throughout the growth of this part of the myth. It keeps getting tacked onto in each retelling, just like you said, and in this edition, I added this, and in this edition, I added that. It's almost always for one simple reason. The people telling it at the time have an interest in portraying the Cherokee as having perpetrated a land grab, quote, just as bad as the one being perpetrated against the Cherokee by the people making that claim.
Sure. And that's something that we see even today, right? Like, well, we did this because they did that kind of thing. Or not even we did this because they, but it's okay for us to do this because they fill in the blank. We see that all across the world.
Totally. One of the best examples of this is John Sevier, the first governor of Tennessee, who wrote in 1802 one of the best known, most referenced versions of this legend. And what he wrote was that some 3 decades earlier, a specific and conveniently deceased Cherokee chief named Oconostota told him that the fortifications at Fort Mountain, Georgia had been built by, quote, white men from across the great water in the time before his fathers. But at the time that he wrote that account, Sevier had spent decades as a general leading campaigns against the Cherokee to set the stage for what eventually turned into the Indian removal or the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
Sevier was somebody who actively wanted the Cherokee gone.
That's what I was going to say when you're early, 1802, where you said, I'm like, yeah, this seems like a prelude to the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act, which, by the way, it's important to note, going back to what I said about not all whatever. Like there are real American heroes that were vehemently opposed to this, like Davy Crockett. But then the flip side is you had these people that just wanted land, and they were like, okay, how do we take this from these people by othering them?
Yep.
And making it seem like, oh, they're not like us, we're entitled to it, and it's okay because they did this other thing. It was like layers of pills to swallow to make it seem easier to do this thing. And it was horrible. And it happened. Who was that? That was under the Jackson administration and the Van Buren administration, I think. I mean, it went on forever. It was terrible.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that makes sense. I'm glad that you brought that up, because as you said, like 1802, I was like, I feel like we're edging into Trail of Tears territory here.
And in fact, well on the path to it. Similar reports to that are just dotted throughout American writing and histories of the same era. And in the same way, there was this genre of Irish folklore about monks sailing west and going on these epic voyages. There was a whole genre in early American writing of legends of, quote, Welsh Indians, to the point that term now exists and is used to refer collectively to the many similar claims made at various times in many parts of the American frontier, wherever that frontier was at the time the claim was being made. Anytime you can point at a map and say, that's what the frontier was that year, there's probably a report from that year in that region claiming that there were, quote, Welsh Indians in that area.
Can you imagine? So like knock on the door, and this is a gross generalization, like go to a house that your great grandfather lived in or something, has been removed from the family for generations. Yeah, I'm going to need this. My great great grandfather lived here and this is mine now. This is family. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
No, I'm just gonna move in. Yeah, you can take your clothes. You can take some of your stuff, but this is mine now.
Whatever you can carry, you're welcome to keep.
And it's also interesting, I mentioned Davy Crockett because he is a person that lived amongst the indigenous people. There was no othering with him. King of the Wild Frontier is the Disney song about Davy Crockett, right?
Right.
But the man did live out on the frontier and worked with the indigenous people. And I think it would be interesting to look into the personal histories of the individuals that are saying, oh, my great great grandfather lived here, therefore I'm entitled to take this. Be like, what's your deal? Have you ever done any, like, how are you okay with this? Have you ever interacted with these people? Oh, you haven't. Oh, color me shocked.
Oh, you've made sure to keep them at an emotional and psychological remove so that you can treat them as objects.
Right. I see. Okay, this all tracks. Yeah. Go on, sir. Tell me more about Prince Modoc or whatever his name was. Modoc's from X-Men. That's I'm worried.
I wonder if Modoc is a prince. Oh, well, anyway.
In his own head, he's a king.
Yeah, in
his own giant head.
Tiny little arms and legs. Sounds like royalty to me. So
grossly deformed from generations. I'm going to stop. Be really mean to monarchies. Somewhere, some member of some royal class is like, I'm done listening to Arcane Carolinas.
We do have listeners in the UK. You never know. A second Elizabeth, a very specific second Elizabeth, might be really bothered by what we're talking about.
You good heavens, I'm just being rude.
Legends of, like, quote unquote Welsh Indians, they crop up from Florida as far north as Kentucky, as far west as Missouri. And they almost always explicitly serve as justification for white claims to land. When Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark west to explore the Louisiana Purchase, he instructed them to find evidence of Welsh Indians in the West and report back.
Gee, what did they find?
Right. They didn't find any. Who knew? But that Welsh Indian myth was so useful that it even permeated art, to the point that a lot of painters, or at least some painters of the period, would depict specific Native American people or specific Native American tribes as lighter skinned than others in an attempt to reflect the painter's individual beliefs that their subjects might be the real, quote unquote, Welsh Indians.
Sure. This is how myths grow.
Yeah. And the same legends and accounts have surfaced periodically ever since. They just kind of keep getting recycled. They almost always get expanded when they do. By the 20th century, a so-called historical marker had been placed in a state park in Alabama, crediting it as the landing site of Prince Madoc, first European to discover the New World.
For those of you that aren't on a webcam with us, my mouth is just hanging open.
Yeah.
What?
In the 21st century, the park removed the sign.
Well, that's good. Okay.
In fact, the Welsh Indians myth was so widespread by the late 18th century that one current theory is that if Oconostodo really told John Sevier about, quote, white people from across the Great Water, he was repeating a story circulated to the Cherokee by other white settlers.
I like that one.
Yeah. And in this regard, Welsh Indians, they're a lot like that thing we talk about of the X-Files effect. The story is so widespread at the time that it inevitably shaped and tainted any account following after it, because that account becomes the lens that everything gets refracted through afterwards.
So at this point, going with the Welsh Indians were the moon-eyed people theory, there's nothing mystical about this track of thinking.
Yeah.
They're just white people.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's the real moon-eyed people legend of the Cherokee?
They're tiny and they live in the ground and they're awesome. Please get to the one that I like.
That's the little people. The real moon-eyed people legend appears to be this account from 1797, written by Benjamin Smith Barton in a book called, and get a load of this 18th century book title, try imagining fitting this on a card catalog card. New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of North America. Written in 1797, but
okay,
the exact new views. The exact quote from that is: the Cherokee tell us that when they first arrived in the country which they inhabit, they found it possessed by certain moon-eyed people who could not see in the daytime. These wretches they expelled.
So, wretch, such a mean word,
isn't it? It's so awful. Like, I read it and I was just like, oh my God, I feel judged.
It just cuts so much deeper than like any like modern 4-letter cuss word that you could call somebody.
Totally.
You wretch. Like, you didn't need to go that far.
It's actually possible that the most neutral account that we have of the legend is from 1902. It's from James Mooney's Myths of the Cherokee, which was published as part of the 19th annual report of the American Bureau of Ethnology. 1902. It's an official publication by real academics whose job was to collect ethnographic information from peoples of the Americas. Mm-hmm. And Mooney quotes Barton's statement, the one that I just read, and then goes on to say that the father of another chief reported in the early 19th century that, quote, an old woman had told him, so you can kind of see how attenuated, again, this legend gets, even in its most reliable tellings, that the moon-eyed people were a race of very small people with extremely white skin who could only see at night, moved into the area for a little while, and lived alongside the Cherokee before going elsewhere.
That just sounds like albino people that are short.
And that's one of the theories. What if there were simply a tribe that had a higher incidence of albinoism?
Yeah. I'm not going to name names because, whatever. I was friends with a kid in elementary school. He was albino and the sun was brutal on him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember that was a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. Totally. But in all these accounts, there are these stone fortifications around that were supposedly built by somebody other than the Cherokee. So who built those fortifications? And who do I think the moon-eyed people were? So these stone walls of Fort Mountain, Georgia, and in other locations in the Southeast, they are super real. You can go visit them. At Fort Mountain, Georgia, there's a state park with nearly 900 feet of clearly, consciously constructed rock wall. It's piled, rough-hewn stones, anywhere from 2 feet to 6 feet high. They look like they're defensive fortifications. They have pits in them sometimes, and there is specifically, at one point in the wall, a gap that appears to have been for a gate to be installed in the wall.
So I'm going to defer to you to answer this because I don't know. That sounds very European in architecture to me.
Yes.
You hear about Native American archaeological finds, and they generally don't have like stone structures in my reading, which is not.
No, they didn't build a lot with stone. They mostly built with wood, and they did a lot of earth mound building, a lot of earth mound construction, not a lot of stone. There are some theories on who built those stone fortifications because they do really exist. One theory that I read, but I didn't see anybody really defending, but it got like listed in a list of suggestions, is unknown French explorers who failed to establish a foothold, didn't really leave a record in the culture of the Cherokee, and failed at establishing these colonies.
Lousy legacy.
Right? Great way to go.
We came, we saw, we died, and no one remembered us.
Another theory is the very Spaniards that the English were trying to compete against for land claims using the myth of Prince Madoc. De Soto's people built fortifications, which we know from Jawara, from that episode about the Brown Mountain Lights, And the walls at Fort Mountain really do exist, and they really do include things like gates and pits, possibly as part of the site's defenses. And the Spaniards had to build defenses because they didn't waste time making enemies, is what I'll say. And in one version of the Moon-Eyed People myth, not just are the Moon-Eyed People white and bearded, but they have red hair. And you get white dudes with red hair and beards building fortifications from across the sea in the distant past. And it starts to sound an awful lot like, what if the Spaniards exploring the region in the early 16th century built some fortifications, then got pushed out, abandoned their effort to colonize what's now the southeastern United States, left behind those fortifications, and 250 years later, the Cherokee are telling John Sevier, yeah, there used to be white people here. They came from across the ocean. We fought them and won.
Vikings supposedly land?
They landed in Newfoundland.
Okay.
There are legends and conspiracy theories and weird, like, alternate historical proposals that they moved further inland or further south. But there's, in part of the reading about this, I saw that there has never been any definitive archaeological proof that they were anywhere other than the eastern coast of Canada.
Okay, cool. I'm really glad that you had done all that research, because I'm like, somewhere in the dustbin of my mind, there's a thing where maybe Vikings hit North America further south.
There have been proposals that they may have explored further in, including maybe making it into the Great Lakes, making it into what's now the upper Midwest. But there's never been any proof found of that. There are stories of people who claim to have found artifacts. Those stories don't really pass the sniff test with me, so I have not included them. Another possibility, though, is the Mississippian culture. You know, we mentioned them briefly in the Brown Mountain Lights as this very complex Native American culture that existed before a lot of what we think of as the Native American tribes. What we think of as the Native American tribes are largely descendants of the Mississippian culture in a lot of ways. We know they had really highly complex construction and architecture. And in the middle of the 13th century, their capital city, which was across the river from modern-day St. Louis, it was larger than London at the same time. Its estimated population reaches as high as 40,000 people, maybe.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah. It was a very, very complicated, planned city with tens of thousands of people living in it, humongous, complex trade networks and agricultural efforts to feed that many people, keep it sanitary, keep them from getting wiped out from disease, things like that. So one criticism of that theory, that maybe the Mississippian culture built these fortifications, and then later the Cherokee saw them and didn't really know who built them, is that the Mississippians are probably the cultural and literal ancestors of many tribes of the southeastern and midwestern United States. So why don't those tribes know more about them? Since the Cherokee, for instance, described the Mississippians as being something of a mystery to them. But it's been pointed out that the Mississippian culture collapsed due largely to disease brought by DeSoto and other explorers. And it was so swift and so thorough that as much as 90% of the Mississippian population was killed in shockingly short time. And within a generation or two, the odds are pretty low that their own descendants would have been able to recognize their artifacts. But we know that Mississippian culture artifacts existed among the tribes of the southeastern United States because there are multiple cases of Mississippian copper artwork being treated as important cultural artifacts by tribes in the southeast when white settlers showed up.
It's like, not to make light of society collapsing, but that's like what we see in science fiction, where like a large society will collapse and like 2 generations removed, people are like picking up objects and being like, oh, what was this for? And like not recognizing things from the past.
Exactly. One of the early accounts of the building style of the Moon-Eyed People stated that they used upright timbers to build circular structures with thatched roofs and a dugout interior floor. A really specific description. And modern recreations of Mississippian homes are exactly that. Circular homes built with upright timbers with thatched roofs and dugout floors. Given the ways the stories get modified or expanded in our culture, as demonstrated by the ways the story of the Moon-Eyed People has been heavily edited and expanded for centuries now by the culture that displaced the Indians from whom they supposedly took it, is it really that far of a stretch to think that the Cherokee might have had a memory of the Mississippian culture's demise, preserved as a legend of the people who looked different, lived differently, and were pushed aside in some earlier time? Mm-hmm. But maybe the Cherokee built them themselves, or maybe Spanish explorers built them. There's absolutely no way for us to know for sure.
Going into this, I thought the Moon-Eyed People were little mystical creatures that lived in the mountains and helped the indigenous tribes. And it turns out that the whole thing is tied up in this explorer myth from the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah. And what you're describing does exist. There are actually two legends that are pretty good candidates for that. One of them is the Cherokee legend of the Nunehi, who were like very helpful beings who would sometimes appear resembling Cherokee and would sometimes like pass as Cherokee themselves and would show up when the Cherokee needed them. And they would help them in battle. They would guide them back home if they got lost in the woods in the winter, things like that.
That's so interesting.
And then the little people, very akin to European fae myths. And there's this whole interesting story about them. And when they cried, they shed these gems, and it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah. The fairy crosses.
Yeah, fairy crosses. But those are totally different.
Wild. Sorry, this did not go any direction that I expected it to. So I'm kind of like, all right, cool. Weird.
And that's the legend of the Moon-Eyed people.
So moon pies, not to be confused with moon eyes, are from Tennessee and have nothing to do with moon-eyed people.
I'm stunned and disappointed.
Yeah. Great. Have you ever been to, you might not have, you may have, I don't know. We've never talked about it. Have you ever been to the ruins of like a ancient city?
No.
It's pretty wild. I went to one in Mexico. It's not the one where you're not allowed to climb on the pyramid. It's one of the ones where you are allowed on like the pyramid, and they make a big deal of like, this is the only one you're allowed to climb on. It's like built around a lake. The complexity of these cities, like you're talking about with the Mississippian culture, is mind-blowing. It just really makes you think like, wow, we are just a blip in history. Yeah. We are such a blip. What a time to be alive. I guess everybody feels that way though, right? Like,
yeah.
What a time to be alive. I just really enjoy exploring these old stories, and learning about stuff that is a true mystery as to who they were is kind of shocking these days. It's just like, oh wait, really? Nobody knows, but there are walls and fortifications that you can go see. Like, that is awesome. That is so cool.
Yeah, the Mississippian culture vanished so quickly that we don't know what they called themselves. And yet, at least 14 tribes of the southeastern United States are considered to be their direct cultural descendants. And they don't know what the Mississippians called themselves.
Thunderhawks.
Maybe they did call themselves Thunderhawks. They actually did have, as part of their religious iconography, a specific bird symbol. And the most complex grave that has been found, like their equivalent to an Egyptian pyramid in terms of complexity of the grave, is a burial mound for somebody who was clearly revered. And he's laid out with his arms spread out and his feet extended in sort of a like bird in flight pose atop a representation of this bird image made out of something like 20,000 of a specific kind of shell that had to be imported to be used as art, and jewels and goods and all kinds of stuff. And then he is buried atop dozens and possibly hundreds of people who were mass buried before his tomb was sealed.
Plot of Thunderhawks is that Prince Maycock is trying to get to, what was his name?
Prince Maycock.
Maydock, not Maycock. Prince Maydock is trying to loot the tomb of the Thunderhawks.
There you go.
I'm not sure where the pet Thunderhawk comes into play. There's something there. We're working on something. It's going to be great. This is going to go down. People are going to be like, do you remember Thunderhawks? And people are going to be like, yeah. And I'm like, no, you don't, because we made it up. We made it up, just like the Moon-Eyed people were made up.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to me to see how that legend, what its origins actually are, and the ways that it has been expanded and fed.
Well, thank you for that. I really like obviously I like when you do the episodes, so I don't have to do anything but show up. But I really appreciate the level of work that you put into the history of it, specifically around the different cultures. And I always appreciate the depth that you go to on that.
Well, thank you. Because if you want somebody to fall down a hole on an obscure research question, I'm your guy.
So thank you for listening. We got new t-shirts in. They should be on the web store by the time this airs. It's a bat. It's cool. It's spooky. Get it now. Wear it all summer.
It looks really awesome.
Black. It will absorb the sun and make you hot, but it'll be really good in the fall. Please do us a favor. If you don't mind, consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast platform you use. It's super easy from your phone. If you use an iPhone, you can click on the podcast application and go to our show, and you can type whatever amount of stars you want to type, or you can add text and tell us how you feel.
Yeah, it's always appreciated, believe me. If you ever wonder whether the people who make something that you enjoy, whether it's a book or a podcast or whatever, actually care what you think about it, they do. And your feedback helps.
Yeah, I mean, we do this for fun and we have a good time, but we consider you as a part of the experience, right? We want to make sure that you're enjoying it. And we need that feedback, good or bad. We prefer good.
Specifically, I need the good feedback.
And thank you to the people that send us hate mail. You keep us warm with all of our chuckles.
Got to burn something when we start the fires.
Because we did. We got some new hate mail that we hadn't acknowledged. So there you go. We see you.
Yeah. It was
Ding
really
dong.
interesting.
Can't stop, won't stop. Spooky stories. We're out.
Validation takes many forms, and sometimes it means continuing to aggravate the haters. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards.
How is it now?
Yeah, now you sound right.
Stop lying. The Moon Knight people are real and I never sound right.